Well, as people are coming in, let me do some introductions here. So welcome to our November edition, almost December edition of our Dockside Chat series. Tom and I were debating whether or not it should be called Dockside, but the water has not frozen here by Lake Minnetonka, so we're still good to go. I think December we will be transitioning to Fireside with the hopeful sense that probably at least we'll be preparing for F-150 trucks to bring out their ice houses onto the lake. I'm Steve Parenti, and I'm joined here by my co-host Tom Gunderson. This is a series that we started this past year, basically for the Medical Evaluation Laboratory. It's also a promotional spot for our latest medical industry program at the Carlson School, the Global Medical Industry MBA, which features the Evaluation Laboratory as its signature experiential learning program. So it's designed for folks that overseas. It's online, except for the Evaluation Lab, which is in person. So today I'm pleased to introduce for our chat, Counselor Eric Hargan, Deputy Secretary, the Honorable. I had the privilege of working with Eric while we were, sort of, if you will, since it felt like a wartime situation, stationed together at the Department of Health and Human Services during COVID-19, while also working in the White House. I believe actually it was Eric that brought me in, having worked with me a little bit a few years before. Eric has many accolades, Harvard being one of them in terms of his training. He previously was actually assistant HHS secretary prior to becoming deputy, and then also worked for HHS is in the general counsel's office prior to that. And so what we're going to be doing here is getting into the key role that Eric played toward the end of his tenure as deputy secretary, which was really playing a navigational aid for Operation Warp Speed. There's actually lots of stuff Eric did, but this is one thing that really fell onto his watch. And then with that, I actually get the privilege of asking the first question when you're ready, Eric.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Steve. Good to be here, and good to join you here from Nashville. It's where I am today. So good to talk to you, and it was a pleasure and honor to work with you. Just say in the trenches as COVID-19 reared its head, and of course on the front lines within the department, I should say. So, Steve, yeah, go ahead.
Sure. I think one thing, Eric, and actually I want to draw a line that I don't know if everyone saw when you had your Wall Street Journal op-ed that was excellent, talking about sort of the origins, if you will, of COVID-19, or at least the response to COVID-19 for Operation Warp Speed. That it, in some respects, people look at it and say, like, wow, that was great that you got all that done in 6 months. But in reality, it was much longer than that.
Yes.
Can you speak to that a little bit as to
sure,
that long tail that went into it?
Yeah, I mean, this was really something that the roots of it lay back 20 years in the past, more or less, starting with the bioterror attacks, the anthrax attacks that were put into Congress. Senator Daschle and Senator Leahy got weaponized anthrax, a very small, finely milled anthrax, very deadly disease, very deadly toxin that produces, is often fatal, but rarely occurs these days in sort of general society. Don't know, most people don't deal with it. It's sometimes called wool handler's disease. It's normally from sheep if you deal with wool. So not common so much anymore. So when it rears its head, it's usually something bad that's happened. Now, in this case, Congress got very, very, of course, naturally agitated about this, and this was all in the wake of 9/11. So everyone's attention was on sort of terrorism and the possibilities of terrorism, and that, of course, had been something out of the blue. What happened at the World Trade Center? This, following on it in close succession, really got people concerned about it. So Congress started a long train of laws that to kind of prepare for disasters and for bioterror attacks. So they commissioned HHS with a series of acts: the Bioterrorism Act in 2002, Project BioShield in '04, finally the Pandemic All Hazards Preparedness Act in '06 kind of successively set the stage for more and more attention to developing countermeasures to potential problems that might happen. Now, this was something that no one thought that the market could take care of. So it wasn't something like we see regular companies like Pfizer or Merck or whomever dealing with on a day-to-day basis. This was something where presumably the government would be the only buyer. So people don't really think about, what will I do if smallpox rearises, or anthrax, or is there another bubonic plague coming? But the government wants to be prepared for it, in addition to other things that it might want to deal with. So for example, if there's a dirty bomb and they need to develop leaching agents to take out radioactive isotopes out of you, what do? Can you prevent fallout from actually developing into cancer and killing people? Possibly. So all these kind of things, though, there's really no buyer except the government. And so what do? Now, this creates a problem for the people who are going to research this. They go, well, I've only got one buyer. How can I tell that the government's really going to buy it at the end of the day? And am I going to make any money? What if it doesn't work? Will the government still somehow reimburse me for it? Most things don't, right? What if I go down a dry hole and nothing happens? How am I going to get reimbursed for this? So all these questions came up. Eventually, the government, on sort of as things continued, the government set up a process that first said, well, you know what, we're going to set an unlimited amount of money to buy these kind of products, and we're going to set this really tough process to get through it. Homeland Security and HHS, Health and Human Services, where I was, you're gonna have all these different subgroups and working groups and times when you're gonna go back and forth and get different approvals, and then there's enough money to do it. Well, then Congress thought about, well, maybe I don't want to limit that amount of money. Here's just a few $1 billion, but left that bad process in place. Eventually, Congress went back after nobody really took advantage of it, revised it, and BARDA was born. Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Agency, kind of like a DARPA, but for HHS. So we set up, that was part of my job. I was there under President Bush. So my first tour of duty at HHS was under President Bush, and this was one of the projects that I had in myself every Monday morning, that a group of the sort of career people showed up in my office, and we worked through what we called the matrix, which was trying to figure out how everyone cooperates. The new agency that was set up to handle bioterror and other terror attacks and other kinds of disasters, plus National Institutes of Health, CDC, and the FDA. How do you kind of thread the needle for these products? So this was an issue. NIH kind of does research, but just research, no products. FDA says, well, if you've got a company and you come to us, we'll help you work through till you got a product. And then CDC at that time had the stockpile. So they'd say, we'll buy it off the shelf when it exists, but we're not going to help you get it there. So it was a real tough project to put these things together. At the time, I thought, we got it done. And I thought, we just launched it. And then I left office. And I thought, if we just get one product a year, be totally happy with this. But instead, BARDA ended up with, by this time, 60 plus products. So it was very successful. And then some things, they weren't even done with products, these vaccines. So some of the things were, how do we produce vaccines faster? One of these things was, '04, we lost half of our vaccine production in the United States. A British company was supposed to deliver us half of our vaccine. Turns out it was dirty. When it got to the United States, FDA inspected it, said, not good enough. We tried to fix it, couldn't be fixed. We lost half of our flu vaccine that year. And so it created this huge impression that vaccine manufacturing is a problem, vaccine production is a problem. And BARDA dutifully set and trained what turned out to be the mRNA vaccine technology, among other things. So while some people thought, it was dumb luck that we were able to produce a vaccine in 8 months, and some people are like, these are superheroes. You did this, it's amazing. And you started from nothing. Neither of those is actually quite true. We were building on a platform that had been going on for like 20 years. And we were able to, in Operation Warp Speed, when we put that together, got the funding, got the structure worked out, who's going to be in charge of what, That took some time. Not that long, though. People were very cooperative. We were able to find these products in many of them in BARDA, 3 of our 6 vaccine, about a dozen diagnostics, the 2 molecular antibodies that have come out already. Those were all there. Not done, but close enough so that we were able to kind of take the resources, human and financial, and basically supercharge that process to bring them out. But they were on the edge, like they were just waiting in the waiting room because of that process that BARDA had continued really for 3 successive administrations of building up this sort of portfolio of countermeasures for different kinds of disasters: biological, chemical, nuclear, radiological, natural. And this was part of it. The 2 most successful vaccines so far in the United States both came from that.
Just as a reminder, we are on the record till I guess it's 6 o'clock or 5 o'clock in Minnesota time, and then we're going to go off the record for half an hour for lots of other questions. Tom, I'll turn the baton over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks, Eric, for joining us here today. I'm struck by, I always have to be reminded about medical devices, pharmaceuticals, biotech in this country being so different from other kinds of products. That's the government regulation that is, in many cases, from industry side, barriers that you have to get through, but then once on the other side of that barrier, they're protecting against some of the research that they've done. But when you have something like like what you've done with warp speed, I'm just curious what it was like to get maybe private industry to trust that this was going to work. What did you have to do that was different to convince Pfizer or Moderna or one of the others to join into this operation and do pedal to the metal?
Yeah, well, that was a multi-pronged sort of activity, frankly. I mean, part of it was bringing in some of the industry veterans inside Warp Speed. So, for example, Dr. Moncef Slaoui, who is in charge of the vaccine side of things, was an industry veteran, one of the most successful, if not the most successful vaccine scientists, but who was at or near retirement. He brought in, and we brought in others, sort of industry veterans, in many cases, recent retirees. You would see them. I visited some of these vaccine factories, and they were all over the place. And they basically came back in to help out. Now, some of that was, I think that was part of it, was the personnel. But some of it was really, I think part of it was the times. I mean, people were being more cooperative because of the urgency of the situation. And, that is something that I sort of thought at the time. I mean, I was a private attorney in the healthcare space, and so I was on both, I've been on both sides, both the government side and the industry side. And you do see it from both angles of how tough the situation is from either side, right? And the lack of trust that happens. And some of it were the practical things that were done that they could count on. In other words, like, for example, we signed contracts with them whereby we would basically pre-commit the money. That if they give us production, we're going to pay for it. In other words, we adopted a much more sort of embedded role with industry. We opened our clinical trial, we opened our NIH clinical trial sites to them so they could use that if they needed to enroll patients and use those. We paid them ahead of time. So, for example, they were doing things parallel rather than seriatim. So normally what you do is you do R&D, right? If you have a successful product with the FDA, then you move to kind of building out the manufacturing lines to produce the product, and then finally you work on distribution. In this case, we made sure that there was enough money allocated to it so that we could pay all of them potentially and sign contracts with all of them so that they would be able to do all these things in parallel. So that at the end of the day, when if you remember, when the vaccine was approved, that weekend, we went to distribute millions of doses of the vaccine. That wasn't a case where, because we had already asked them, go ahead, manufacture ahead of time. If it doesn't work or there's some problems with it from FDA point of view, that's kind of on us. We paid for it anyway. But it turns out that, say, those first two vaccines, we were ready, we were saving time by getting those millions of doses, at least a period of time so they could prepare the next lot while we were busy distributing the first lots of vaccines at the same time. That was something different. We also did a number of other things, like things that seem simple, like the advisory committee process to reduce time on this. Instead of us waiting, as one normally does, 2 or 3 advisory committees at FDA or CDC, both of which they were going to be going in front of, we were, instead of saying, we'll wait 6 months or 8 months till the advisory committee meets, we told the advisory committee, move your meetings up. We will send you the data, move your meetings closer, much closer to when the FDA is prepared to send it. It's a national emergency. And of course they agreed. The people on the advisory committee agreed. They weren't going to go like, well, no, we've got the meeting scheduled in June. Everybody's going to have to wait till June. Of course, they moved those forward. But that saved probably a year, maybe, could have saved a year off the 4 or 5 year timeline that we would otherwise see. Other things that sound obvious but weren't is that when the files came in for those products, they were moved to the front of the line at FDA. So we just said, this is a priority. So everyone else moves down a notch. Normally you'd go through a regular cycle and things, last in, last out, first in, first out, but instead go to the top. Now that means, again, and so people would go, why was this able to be done so quickly? So it is that. It's simply ranking, you go to the front of the line. Normally, that's not what happens when you have products. They got to go through the regular cycle. They don't get to be advanced forward. In this case, they were. So those were, and the fact that we de-risked the companies by saying, you will be paid for this, and here's what you will be paid. But that negotiation took place means that from a finance point of view, and this, sort of where, I come from, that sort of my background, corporate finance and M&A and healthcare area, you don't have a situation where a company, whether it's more or less a startup like Moderna or even an established company with a lot of vertical integration like Pfizer, where they don't have to look over their shoulders and say, I got through phase 1, I got to go back to the financiers, either internal or external, and say, do we have enough money for phase 2? Or do we have enough money for phase 3? Or what's the market going to be? Are we going to be able to sell this, right? So you don't constantly go back to the salespeople. You don't constantly go back to market research. You don't go back to, the finance people and say, do we have enough money for this? Where does this fall in the priorities between all the other products we're making at this time? Because you've been de-risked by the government because it's a national priority, a national emergency. So they don't have to do that. And that takes a lot of time out of the process of going back onto the finance or the marketing and sales people or all that and trying to figure out whether or not you should move forward and in what priorities should you move on a particular product. And I think that a lot of that outside people that understand the business may seem like it's, what's the big deal, but it's actually a lot of time spent, particularly in the startup area. It's quite a lot of time is spent with FDA products companies, particularly startup or early stage ones, kind of going, wait, as you move through the phases like that. And there were, obviously we had 6 different vaccine candidates that we were funding, which meant that there was competition too, with that and that. I'm pretty sure that played a factor in that as well.
Steve, if I could just ask one follow-up on that, it would be 6 vaccines that got into this form. There was diagnostics that got in. You mentioned the monoclonal antibodies. Yep. Did you have anybody over your shoulder saying, okay, let's limit it to 4 vaccines and 6 diagnostics, or how did the screening for that go?
So really, when we sort of more or less announced inside the industry, we had over 100 vaccine candidates that came forward. And so the clinical team, so there's a set of clinicians, doctors and scientists that looked at these things and started reducing them down, kept sort of narrowing what I called the funnel, the sort of funnel as we like moved towards down to like 14 and then 8 kind of, and then 6. That eventually were the candidates that could fit in through. So we set some parameters at the beginning, which is, how credibly can you say you're going to produce a safe and effective vaccine? How much production capacity will you have? Like, you have to have so many hundreds of millions of doses by the end of Q1 2021. Here's the parameters. So we had both companies that's kind of either end, that either couldn't credibly talk about the science or couldn't credibly talk about the production. So, we had at least one that was like, I can give you all, and they had a very good idea, a very traditional idea about how to produce vaccine, but it would have been, they were like, well, we'll get to you in 2023 with the vaccine. That didn't hit the warp speed set of parameters. For warp speed, it could be a perfectly wonderful vaccine and do everything that they said it would do. It just didn't fit into the parameters that we had to set given the national emergency. So you set a set of parameters, and here's who kind of came out of that process of whittling down from those set of parameters into those that could make it across the line. And then therapeutics was a completely different thing. It had lots and lots of candidates. It had more areas than there were the total number of vaccines, but it was its own process on that side. Monoclonal antibodies, fractionated heparin, immunomodulators. I mean, there was a whole bunch of things on that, antivirals, that different categories of them. And there were lots of components there, but it was more, it didn't, because the vaccines sort of had that more, obviously had more prevalence in the public view. That was sort of, therapeutics was always kind of like, oh yeah, therapeutics. But part of it is just because I think the complexity of it, just even trying to portray what was happening. But we did have successes in that space as well, like the 2 monoclonal antibodies, and you can see some of the things that were, that were in the pipeline as well. So those I expect will have gotten their boost as well, but just a different world. And the diagnostics were somewhat separate. A lot of those issues, they weren't in part of warp speed, technically, weren't part of warp speed, but were on a different track because they were early on. The issues on the tests arose very early in the administration, and those diagnostics got done in order, in a different way, but not through this the more deliberative, here's a board, here's people in charge, here's the teams built out at HHS and Department of Defense. That was also an interesting oddity, right? Is that you have Department of Defense and HHS working together, sort of almost the opposite ends of the spectrum traditionally within the departments, right? They're doing really different things. I mean, they're patching soldiers up, obviously, but there is a military health system, and it's a big deal. But it's very different. The different feelings of the 2 departments. So it's very interesting to be on the 6th floor. That's sort of the sort of leadership floor where the secretary and myself were, and see these, the fatigues and the camo and the generals around in the Humphrey building. So it was a really different feel to it than you normally see. You didn't see the doctors and the scientists and so on walking around. They were there obviously, but also seeing the other group was interesting.
A quick question on this one, I think, Eric. I mean, I'm just thinking back, like when was the December 7th moment to suddenly go like, oh, wait a second, we need to pull out all the stops to make warp speed occur? Because I mean, you think about the TikTok, there's identification of COVID in China, more or less coming in late December. I mean, from the White House perspective, we were sort of tracking it. We didn't really know, first there's the question of who's coming off the cruise ships in Washington and stuff like that. But when did everything change?
Well, I mean, I guess you'd have to say there's probably at least a couple of different things in there. One is, when did it change early on? That would be January. I mean, you say late December, is actually December 31st. Okay, that's when China called CDC and our CDC and said, by the way, here's something. That's why it's COVID-19 and not COVID-20. December 31st, 2019. So it's COVID-19. Anyway, so we heard about it. And, there are, at HHS, which may surprise some people, you get all kinds of reports of all kinds of terrible things happening in the world. Every outbreak of all kinds of things, like there's Nyang fever in North Carolina today, or there's a report of bubonic plague in Indianapolis. These kind of things happen, whether they're true or not. They come into the department all the time. This was somewhat different in that it was an official kind of notification from, another country that there was something going on. And so we kind of rallied fairly quickly in January because, we had obviously, there had been those of us who had been around in the Bush administration had seen the avian flu and several other potential outbreaks that could have developed into what COVID-19 did develop into, but didn't. And as you know, like even by the end of the month, we were having the travel ban, which was unprecedented, and other things that had really kind of gotten ginned up. So from one point of view, the response, the Diamond Princess and all the issues were happening very early on. The Warp Speed, what became Warp Speed, which was originally called MP2, Manhattan Project 2, Manhattan Project for Health, was starting. The vaccines were already starting. In other words, people were sequencing and trying to develop early vaccines. But then towards the end of March is when that kind of started crystallizing. And then Warp Speed, by that name, is really April, early April, first half of April is when it becomes Operation Warp Speed, so-called. The memo is written. That's, and that's when government, it's real, the memo. That's when it's real. It's got a name, it's got a memo, and now it's real. I'm being a little bit disingenuous there, but it was sort of late March is when it's crystallizing and getting whiteboarded, and then early April is when it launches officially, and sort of all the charts are built out and people know start knowing who's doing what. Because of course, in a project this complicated and multifaceted, there's a lot of coordination that has to happen among everybody, because it was just something that while each of the elements might have already been there, prepaying, contracting, government support for research and, a lot of that stuff had been there, but putting it all into one single effort, I think, was something that in itself was new, was the combination of the pieces and bringing them all together. Because it wasn't like Congress immediately passed a bunch of new authorities. Now you can do this. They were relying on things that had been there, but putting them together all together. In something that turned out to do something very effective and new.
I mean, and we're about to go off the record, but I think the thing that fascinates me is that, so it happened, you got it on December 31st, 2019. Imagine if it comes December 31st, 2016 in the middle of a presidential transition, right?
Imagine if it's COVID-20.
Right.
I mean, imagine if that's December 31st, right. 2020.
Right.
I mean, and we get the word 1 year later, yeah. Right? And we're leaving office, right? And it's like, there were elements that were fortunate in that it was the 4th year of an administration. You don't want to say anything about this as fortunate because it's a pandemic. It's terrible from a personal point of view, a global point of view. But things could have been worse, if you can believe that, right? Things could have been worse, which is that if we hadn't been in the 4th year of an administration when everybody kind of knows what they're doing, and they're all kind of know what their positions are, and that would have been very different than handing it over to a new crew, if we had gotten it a year later and had been handing it over to somebody new who was just kind of trying to like get their laptop started and like, where's the bathroom? And, and all of a sudden they're plunged into it. So that would have been much worse from a national response point of view. I mean, I don't think there's any, well, I mean, I guess people could question it, but to me, it didn't matter right, left, or center. If you have, people in the fourth year and in the first term, that's traditionally about as high functioning as, as administrations get, because people sort of know where they are, know what they're doing. They've worked out the kinks and how they're operating. And then, so yeah, I think that part of it, that could have been worse. Yeah.
Well, thank you. We are officially going to transition to go off the record.